האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov, Dobrev Yetcher, and good evening to everyone. We're in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Chayei Sorah. We're going to be doing the first part of Os Gimel, section number 3. And before we do that, we're going to take a look at a pasuk from the beginning of the Parsha, Perek Chaf Gimel, pasuk Beis, which says as follows: Vatomas Sorah bekiryas Arba. And Sorah died in the city of Kiryas Arba, he Chevron, which is the city of Chevron, Be'eretz Canaan, in the land of Canaan. Vayavo Avraham, and Avraham came, lispod l'Sorah, to eulogize Sorah, v'liv kosa, and to cry for her. It's noteworthy that in the last word of the pasuk, v'liv kosa, the letter kaf is written small. It's a smaller than the other letters in the word. In other words, smaller than the normal size of letters. When you would read that pasuk, you'd see that letter stands out for being small. And the Zera Shimshon, of course, is going to talk about that. So let's get right into the Zera Shimshon, section Gimel, section 3, Chayei Sorah. Pasuk. The pasuk says, "Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sorah," and Avraham came to eulogize Sorah, kodem v'liv kosa. Before the pasuk, and it says that Avram came to eulogize her. Before it says he came to cry for her. And the Zera Shimshon says that adam bochal meso. This is problematic because first a person cries for a lost relative, ula basof maspido, and only afterwards does a person eulogize for their lost relative, right? So in this pasuk, it seems to have things out of order because it says Avraham came to eulogize for Sarah and to cry for her. Zera Shimshon says that's not the order. That's not the appropriate order. The order should say he came to cry for her and then to eulogize her. Dishlosha levechi v'shiva lehespe. So here the Zera Shimshon quotes from a Gemara in Moed Katan that says of the 7 days of the Shiva, the first 3 should be for crying, and the last 4 of the 7, meaning the remainder of the 7, lehesped, should be for eulogizing and talking about all of the fine qualities of the deceased. So it's not just a common thing that people cry first and say eulogies later. It's actually brought down in the Gemara. So that's one question. The first question on the pasuk, the ode, and another question on the pasuk, lama yesh kaf ze'era. Why is there a small letter kaf b'milas v'liv kosa in the word v'liv kosa, and to cry for her? So those are the Zera Shimshon's 2 opening questions on this pasuk. Okay, next paragraph. V'yuvan. This may be understood b'mashe kosav bal sefer ma'avar yabok, in what's written by the author of the sefer ma'avar yabok b'ma'amar svas emes, in the section of that sefer entitled svas emes, perek yutes, the 19th chapter, v'zeh lashono. And this is what the author of the Ma'avar Yabok says: "V'hahesped lemeis hu to'eles godol." Eulogies said for a deceased person are highly effective. Ki al yedei hadimaos, because through the tears that are caused by the hespedim, by a proper eulogy, through the tears that come from listening to a eulogy, yifoschu lames share dimo ha'elyonim. The heavenly gates of tears are opened, hamisulokim min hadin, which are removed from the midas hadin, from the quality of justice, from Hashem's justice. So in other words, the Sefer Ma'avar Yabok says that hespedim, eulogies, are very important at a funeral because they induce people, they elicit tears, they elicit crying, And those tears from people, those sincere tears from people at that time, help open up the Sharei Dima, the gates of tears in Shamayim, which is for the benefit of the mace. It's the benefit of the deceased, because that moves things away from the Midas Hadin and presumably more in the direction of the Midas Harachamim. And of course, every person who leaves this world needs Hashem's mercy, needs Hashem's compassion when they are being judged for their actions in this world. Ki omram, as Chazal say in Meseches Brachos, Sharei Dima lo nin alu. The gates of tears are never closed. So Hespedim leads to crying. Crying opens the gates of the Sharei Dima, the gates of tears. This is all for the benefit of the mace, of the deceased individual. Omnam, however, tzarech sheyiyeh habechi l'so'eles hanefesh. It's necessary for the crying to be for this spiritual purpose, for the opening of the gates for the benefit of tears, for the benefit of the mace. V'lo l'so'eles hachomer, and not for a materialistic benefit. Ad kan l'shono, until here is a quote from the Ma'avar Yobok. So the Ma'avar Yobok talks about the importance of the eulogies and the crying for the benefit of the mace, but emphasizes to us that the crying has to be for this spiritual benefit for the mace, and not for some materialistic purpose, which could mean not simply crying because a person is sad, which of course that's one of the reasons for crying, and that's a healthy reason to cry, that a person is sad over a loss. But the Ma'avar Yobok encourages us to elevate our crying at a funeral, at the time of a funeral, to have a kavanah, an intention to cry for the benefit of the spiritual benefit for the person who passed away. Uchedei lirmos shehabechi shelo hoyu l'so'eles hanefesh, in order for the pasuk to hint to us that Abraham's crying was for a higher spiritual purpose, v'lo l'so'eles hachomer, and not for a more mundane or a lower level type purpose, hiniach hakaf ze'era. The letter kaf was written in the word livkosa, to cry for her, was written in a smaller fashion. Lomar, to say, shemiat bivichiyoso. Avraham limited his crying. Shelobocha klape hachomer. He didn't cry for mundane reasons, or you might say for common reasons. Elamach mas hesped l'so'eles hanefesh, but rather to partake and to participate in eulogizing Sarah for the spiritual benefit that the Ma'avar Yobok described above. So if the word Vilif Koso was written in the regular way, we would just read it in a simple way, that Avraham came to cry for Sarah, like all people, Rachmana litzlan, cry at a funeral, at the loss of a loved one. But the Torah wrote the kaf with a small form to tell us that there was something unique about Avraham's crying, and in a way it was limited, because he wasn't crying just in the way a regular person was crying. He was crying in an elevated spiritual way for the benefit of Sarah Imenu's neshama. Umishum hachi amar lispod l'Sarah. And this is also why the pasuk said things out of order. And first it says to eulogize for Sarah, ve'achar koch v'livkosa, and afterwards it says to cry for her, meaning that not only the small kaf, but also the order of the phrases indicate to us this higher level crying that Avraham did, because he came to eulogize for Sarah, and afterwards to cry for her. If regular crying was happening, if Avraham was crying the way people generally cry at a funeral, and that's all that was happening, then it would have said he cried for her and he eulogized her, because that would be, as the Zera Shimshon pointed out before, that would be the normal order. But the Torah said this is not the normal order. This is not the ordinary type of crying. This is something unique and special and highly spiritual. There's a spiritual lesson here from Avram Avinu, and the Torah indicates that in addition to the small kuf, by also talking about Abraham eulogizing her first, and afterwards talks about his crying, because the point of the eulogy, as the Mavar Yavok said it, was to elicit these tears, these spiritual tears, these tears for the benefit of the mace, and opening the gates of heaven of Sharei Dima for the mace. And so it says Lifspod, Avram came to do the eulogy. His intention from the beginning was to provoke tears that would open up the Sharei Dima, and then he cried for her specifically for that reason. That's the Zera Shimshon's first approach to answer the two questions, and now he's going to offer some other ideas. Next paragraph. V'od yesh lomar, and we can also say, Shahakosov lo zochar habechi rishon. The pasuk did not mention crying first. Shederech lovo machmas hateva, because crying is something that happens naturally. Shahare tekev she'adam shomeya, immediately when a person hears. Ezo shmua ra'a, bad news. O roa eze mikra ra, or he sees a tragic event take place. Bar minan, these things should be kept far from us. Ein of zolgos dima, his eyes naturally flow with tears. Ve'eno shum shevach v'chavod l'sara, and this type of crying would not have been a particular form of praise and honor for Sarah. In other words, natural crying that happens because a person has a loss or is sad or hears about a sad event is certainly fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but in and of itself, it doesn't capture a special honor and a special praise for the person who passed away. And so the Torah doesn't mention crying first, because then again, we might have confused it with Abraham's that he was just crying. He was sad, and it was regular crying that all people do when they become aware of a tragedy or suffer a loss. And even the crying that came based on the eulogy, ein tzorech lehaskiro, that itself would not have been needed to be mentioned. The bichlal mosayim mona, because we have a rule in Chazal that included in 200 is 100, which means in this context, what it means is the pasuk really didn't have to mention crying at all, because the regular normal crying that everybody does is nothing. The Torah doesn't need to say Avraham did that kind of crying. That would not have been anything equal to the tears over the loss of someone as unique and special as Sarah Imenu. So the Torah didn't mention crying that came before the Hespedim. And even mentioning crying after the Hesped, which the pasuk did do, it talked about Vilif Kosa after it talked about Vilif Spod Sarah. After talking about Avram eulogizing Sarah, it talked about him crying. If it's the kind of normal tears that come from a hesped, the Torah wouldn't have happened mentioned that also, because included in 200 is 100, meaning Avraham, when he said his hespedim, of course had the kavana to elicit crying. And if he elicited crying and tears from the listeners, then certainly it elicited crying and tears from him, who was the closest person there by far to Sarah Imenu. So we can assume, as Zera Shimshon's point is, we can assume that certainly Avraham cried after he gave the Hespedim for Sarah, because the Hespedim caused other people to cry, and so it certainly would cause Avraham to cry. So therefore, the whole mentioning of Avraham crying has to be something that we haven't yet explained. It's teaching us something that we haven't yet touched upon. When the Torah writes Avraham came to cry for Sarah, it's teaching us a novel idea, a new idea. It is not talking about any kind of normal, ordinary, regular crying. It's teaching us that even after the days of eulogizing Sarah ended, so the Shiva was over, even after the Shiva ended, Kol od shehoyu zocher ma'aseha ugevuroseha. Any time that Avraham, after the Shiva, recalled Sarah's actions and her strengths, be'iske besa uveyiras Hashem, and the things that had to do with how she conducted her household and in fear of Hashem. Anytime he remembered Sarah's spiritual activities and mitzvah activities and how she conducted herself in all these areas, Einav Zolgos Dima, his eyes flowed with tears, and those are the tears that are being referred to in the pasuk. So let's pause here for a moment. So this is the Zera Shimshon's second a way of explaining the fact that the pasuk mentions that Avraham cried after the hesped as opposed to before it. And here in this paragraph, what the Zera Shimshon is adding is a beautiful idea that Avraham continued to cry after the Shiva and after the normal crying, so to speak, would have ended. As a matter of fact, any time after Sarah's death, when he remembered her specialness and her unique qualities, he cried in that remembrance and remembering those things. And that is certainly a tremendous tribute to Sarah and her special midos and her special qualities. Next paragraph. Ve'osi shapir shehifsik b'milas l'Sarah. And it makes sense, it fits in nicely that the Torah interrupted, so to speak, using the word l'Sarah, bein lispod v'lifkosa, between the words to eulogize and to cry. So in the pasuk again, it said, "Vayovo Avram lispod l'Sarah v'lifkosa." So the Zera Shimshon now is pointing out the word l'Sarah being right in the middle of to eulogize and to cry was done for a very specific reason. It's not there just because it has to be there grammatically, or it has to be there just to understand, to have a simple understanding of the pasuk, as the Zera Shimshon is going to show right now. Shehoyo lo lomar, because the pasuk could have said lifspod v'lifkos es Sarah, to eulogize and to cry for Sarah. Okay, Sarah did not have to come between the words eulogize and cry. Sarah could have been the subject of the sentence after those two verbs, lispod v'lifkos as Sarah. Elevadai shelispod l'Sarah, but definitely the words the Torah wanted to say to eulogize for Sarah first before mentioning crying, kvar nigmar hachiyov shehoyo lo lasos, because that shows that he came and he eulogized for Sarah at the time of her death during the Shiva. And of course, he cried for her, which is Zera Shimshon demonstrating in the previous paragraph, is understood that Avraham cried for her. And then Lispod l'Sarah could say that's the end of Avraham's obligatory actions in terms of the Shiva, in terms of the burial in the Shiva. Ve'achar kach v'lifkosa, but putting the word v'lifkosa after lispod l'Sarah, hu inyan acher, that means it's something else. There's something, as the Zera Shimshon pointed out above, that's special and unique about the crying that Avraham did, because it's crying that he did much, much later and way after the events of the funeral and the Shiva, and it took place for many years afterwards whenever Avraham remembered Sarah and her uniqueness. Continuing to the next page. The old Yesh Lomar, top right column, and there is another thing to say here. The lo hayitzarich kro lomar lispod l'Sarah. The pasuk didn't even need to mention Sarah's name at all when it said to make eulogies for Sarah. Why didn't it have to mention her name? Shekfar Omar, because the previous pasuk already said Vatomas Sora Bikiryas Arba. I'm sorry, not the previous pasuk. The beginning of that same pasuk says, and Sora died in Kiryas Arba, as we read the pasuk before. V'chule, etc. V'hoya lo lomar, and therefore the pasuk could have said, Vayovo Avraham lisofta v'livkosa, and Avraham came to eulogize her and to cry for her. Meaning, Sarah was already mentioned. The pasuk already, the Torah already told us that Sarah died. So all it had to say was, and Sarah died in Kiryas Arba, he Chevron, and Avraham came to eulogize her and to cry for her, or to eulogize and to cry for her. In other words, that's how pronouns work. You don't have to mention the name of the person repeatedly. You can just mention the name of the person in the beginning and then say, in this case, and Avram came to eulogize and cry for her. So why does the pasuk say lispod l'sara in a way that seems to be unnecessary? Ela mishum dekai malan. But the reason for this is because of what we hold in a Gemara in Masechta Ksubis, Ola imo ve'ena yoredes. The Gemara over there is talking about a woman's status, and there's a discussion about what happens if a woman marries a man who is either on a higher social status than her own or a lower social status. So the Gemara says, Ola imo, her social status can be raised because of her husband's higher status, ve'ena yoredis, but it doesn't go down. It can't go lower. So meaning if a woman comes from a family in which, because of their prominence, perhaps because of their wealth, perhaps because of their religious attributes, maybe there are Torah scholars in the family, for whatever reason, if this woman comes from a family with a higher, an important chashivos, an important status in the community, so if she marries a husband who's has a higher status, comes from a family and a background that's even a higher social status, she must be treated. There are halachic ramifications as to how she is treated, and she must be treated in a way that is equivalent to his. She goes up in status based on her husband's status. However, Eino Yoredis, however, she doesn't go down. So if she marries a person on a lower rung of the social order, she still must be treated to what her status was before she married this man. And therefore, when you say a eulogy for a woman, you may eulogize not just her own achievements, but also the things that her husband did, because of this Gemara that says she goes up, she is elevated based on the status of her husband. So the eulogies can include talk of her and her husband. Lefichach, therefore, Omar HaKosov Lispod Lisara, the Torah specifically used Sarah's name again in a way that it didn't have to say Avraham came to eulogize, to say eulogies for Sarah, Dafka, specifically for Sarah. Sha'avraham lo ba lehaspid l'Sara. Avraham did not come with the intention of saying eulogies for Sarah bishvil shehayiso ishto bilvad, because she was his wife. That's not his intention. Wasn't to talk about how Sarah deserved praise because she was such a good wife for him. But he did talk about that, because it's important to talk about what a wonderful wife she was. But also he wanted to talk about praise that came to her for her own actions and her own achievements and her own accomplishments. Af im lo hayusa ishto, even had she not been his wife. Al derech shepirshu zichronim levracha, and this is similar along the lines of what Chazal say in the Medrash Rabbah, when Sarah was telling Avraham that Yishmael had to be sent away. She said, "This Yishmael will not inherit im bini im Yitzchak, with my son with Yitzchak. That's what she said. Those were her words. Im b'ni, with my son, im Yitzchak, with Yitzchak. So in the Medrash, Chazal point out that apparent repetition. Why did Sarah say with my son and with Yitzchak? That's the same person. So they say afilu eino Yitzchak, that Yishmael could not be allowed to inherit along with Yitzchak, even if he wasn't on the level of Yitzchak, meaning Sarah was saying, whoever my son would have been, my son is Yitzchak, that's a fact, and he's a great tzaddik and an extraordinary human being. However, if whoever my son would have been, I would still not want my son to share the inheritance with Yitzchak. I'm sorry, with my son. And then she added, Im Yitzchak, with Yitzchak, afilu eno b'ni. If the person in question was Yitzchak, a tzaddik like Yitzchak, even if he wasn't my son, I would argue and say that Yishmael should not share the inheritance with him. So that Chazal is explaining, that Medrash Rabbah is explaining why Sarah chose her words carefully and said, Im b'ni, im Yitzchak. And so too, Zera Shimshon says that's exactly what's happening here. Avram Avinu came, and the Torah emphasized he came to eulogize Sarah, even though mentioning the word Sarah wouldn't be necessary, which teaches us that when Abraham spoke about Sarah, he said she deserves praise, number one, because of Sarah, who she was, even if I wasn't married to her, even if she wasn't married to me, she was such a tzaddikas that she deserves praise. And certainly I would come to eulogize my wife, even if my wife wasn't on the level of a tzaddikas like Sarah. So because Sarah had both of the qualities of being married to Abraham and being in her own right a great tzaddikas, a great righteous individual, Abraham came to have both of those things in mind when he eulogized Sarah. So we're going to stop here, but just to briefly recap, everything started with the pasuk from the beginning of our parsha of Chayei Sarah in a close analysis of the words used, lispod l'Sarah v'livkosa, to eulogize Sarah and to cry for her. And the Zera Shimshon also added in notice the small kaf, as the Meforshim do, and he gave several explanations that teach us all of the lessons that can be learned, or many of the lessons, I should say, that can be learned from the specific wording in the pasuk, and all of them speak in beautiful ways to the tributes that Abraham paid to Sarah, and also speak to the incredibly high spiritual level of Sarah Imenu herself. Yasher Koch to joining us in the Zera Shimshon this week, and we will look forward to learning again in the Zera Shimshon on next week's Parsha.